Good morning and welcome to the UN Global Compact Academy webinar session. Today we'll be discussing the perspectives from Africa on leadership in a global crisis. We're now facing the full global threat of this pandemic with unprecedented social and economic impact. While we must scale up the immediate health response to curb the spread of COVID-19, the response to the pandemic cannot be delinked from the SDGs. From reversing progress on good health, SDG 3, to the negative impact on 1.25 billion students, SDG 4, the pandemic is affecting vulnerable societies the most. COVID-19 has exposed fundamental weaknesses in our global systems. It has shown how the prevalence of poverty, weak health systems, lack of education, and a lack of global cooperation exacerbate the crisis. The crisis has reinforced the interdependence of our world. It has brought to the fore the urgent need for global action to meet people's basic needs, to serve our planet, and to build a fairer and resilient world. We face common global challenges that we must solve through common global solutions. I would like to open our discussion today, which will be for 45 minutes, by asking each of our speakers to briefly reflect for a couple of minutes each on the crisis and the impact that it currently has on their respective organizations, employees, and communities in Africa. I will now introduce the distinguished speakers that we have today. We have Ms. Vera Songwe, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary for the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Ms. Songwe, you're welcome. With us today also, we have Jeremy Awori, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer for Absa Bank, Kenya. Welcome, Jeremy. And we also have Hassan Medagrhi, the founding partner of Africa Impact Ventures. You're most welcome, Hassan.
Thank you.
So I would please ask each speaker for 2 minutes to just briefly reflect on the crisis and the impact that it currently has on your respective organizations, employees, and communities in Africa. We'll start off with Vera. Could you share your perspectives with us, please?
Thank you, Bola, for having me, and greetings to everybody. We are in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and of course we are the United Nations, so we are across the world. The first impact that it has had is, I think, more than ever before, it has put the UN at the forefront of responding to the crisis. WHO is our #1 agency that is responding to the crisis, and I think it's supporting most of the countries in this pandemic. So unlike many people, we have frontline agencies that have been working continuously on the crisis. WHO, WFP, we know that before the crisis, there were about 27 million Africans that were going hungry. That number has increased even more, so we need to work even harder. The Secretary General has said that, the systems of the United Nations are alive and working throughout this crisis. So my sense is, I think, particularly from our humanitarian colleagues at the UN, WFP, UNHCR, refugees, we don't think about them when we talk about lockdowns. Where do they go? Internally displaced people. So we have that whole set of United Nations agencies that are really toiling day in and day out to make sure that we get the right things. WHO is training our health staff across the continent to ensure that, Africa is ready. We have been lucky. Particularly at the Economic Commission for Africa, what have we done? I think we were one of the first that came out on March 18th with a report about the economic impacts of the crisis on the continent. At the time, it was just beginning. We thought it was going to hit us with about 1.4% of our GDP will be wiped out. Now we are talking about maybe, if we're lucky, we would get from 3.2 to 1% of our GDP. We brought together finance ministers on the continent, and I think called for, some relief for the continent, a debt service. We have been very busy working now to ensure that we can get the resources that Africa needs very quickly to respond, both to the health crisis, but more importantly, I think to the economic crisis, which is devastating our women and our economies, our service sectors, the airline, the tourism. So ECA has been very, very busy. We have been working very hard. We've been working from home, and maybe some of the panelists will agree with me that there has been, I think, levels of productivity have gone up in some cases. But we're also very fortunate that a lot of our staff have stayed safe and that we have not had any cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Songwe. Indeed, I would agree with you that the level of productivity has gone up. And of course, as you said, the double whammy of both a health crisis and an economic crisis. Thanks very much. Can we have some comments from Jeremy, please? Your opening comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bola, and glad to be here today. From Absa Bank's perspective, I think there have been 3 or 4 areas that I think we've been impacted. If we look at it from a medical perspective, essentially one of the first priorities was to make sure that staff and colleagues are safe and that we are able to offer banking services to our customers in a safe way. So in many instances, because we are a frontline essential service operator, we have to keep services running for our customers. So it involved evoking business continuity plans, remote working, as well as how do we offer services safely for our customers when they walk into our banking hall. So we had to invoke, obviously, our business continuity, making sure that our remote banking channels are working, internet, phone banking, so that customers themselves don't actually have to come in. And then obviously there was a big impact around the human reaction to this, people feeling uneasy. Am I safe if I go and I'm offering services out there interacting with people and I'm not sure whether they're infected? So there was the whole issue of disinfecting our premises, managing that and communicating that to customers, and also people adjusting to working remotely. How do you manage teams? How do you deliver those services? And how do you keep moving your strategic agenda going forward? I think the second area, which was very critical, is really a customer-oriented focus. At the end of the day, this is impacting someone across the board, retail customer, an SME customer, or a large corporate. So we very quickly had to look at our policies, our approach to trying to ease, in particular, the cash flows that were affecting our business and our customers. And we came up with a number of processes around loan repayment, holidays, restructuring, moratoriums, etc., to try and ease the cash flow, to keep business in particular open, to keep employment levels as high as we possibly could as we try to manage through this crisis. So there's been a big customer impact around trying to understand, because now we need to really round our customers and we need to use different techniques to manage going forward. I think the third area is really around how do we partner, not just with our customers, but with other stakeholders, with government, with the medical authorities, with the Ministry of Health, to really support the government in managing this pandemic, because this is not something governments can manage alone. So we've put all the best and brightest brains from the private sector together, to try and find solutions to some of these problems. And linked in there is also just our being a force for good. So in our case, Absa has really looked at how can we contribute, and we've made fairly significant contribution in terms of buying equipment, things like PPEs, to protect our frontline workers, also providing psychosocial support to the frontline healthcare workers, as well as those in isolation and quarantine, to make sure that they can come through this, process with as little impact as possible. I think last but not least, the other area is, so how do we come out better as a result of this crisis? How do we get business moving as quickly as we can? How do we restore economic growth? And how do we leapfrog? We've got, I guess, in a way, an opportunity to invest in our healthcare infrastructure that lives beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have to start thinking about how do we run businesses if this COVID pandemic lasts as it is predicted into next year, because we have to adjust the way we run our business in a different way. I don't think any of us is going to run our businesses the same after this pandemic. Automation has come in, remote working has come in, business models have had to change, pricing models have had to change. So we're putting our minds together as the private sector and as a business to be able to adjust to this new environment.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your opening comments. And you've summarized your actions with your colleagues, your staff, your customers, and indeed that the world of work has changed, completely, and for all of us. Thank you very much for that. We'll now move on to Hassan for your opening comments, please, and reflections.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, Mrs. Adesola. Hi, Mrs. Songwe. Hi, Mr. Awori, and thank you for having me. To answer your question, I would like to start by saying that this is a a huge chance to bring to the front sensitive issues that we have ignored for long, both at the public and the private levels. I would like to focus on two particular aspects. One is positive and the other is a negative one. On the negative side, what this pandemic has revealed is the extreme dichotomy and fragmentation our communities in Africa live in, with the informal economy playing a significant role in almost all African countries. The COVID crisis and the interruption of all economic activities made it not only difficult, but quasi-impossible for hundreds of millions of people and families to get access to their daily livelihood. In addition, all the government funding and support revealed quite difficult in systems where people are not officially declared on payrolls and on social security systems and don't even have bank accounts. The positive side, I see that the pandemic saved Africa, I would say a minimum of 10 years in terms of digitalization and adopting new models. But be it in education, remote working, telehealth, or any other vertical. As a matter of fact, both government and private sectors adopted technology in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks. And we have noticed that versus what could have taken decades. I see this as a very promising for the post-COVID life. To my knowledge, there are a few sectors that have proven to be resilient in times of this historical and unprecedented crisis. These sectors include primarily agriculture, education, health, financial inclusion, and renewable energy. And this is exactly where Africa needs to stand out in order to develop and improve so as to respond to a growing market demand. This demand is internal, and it's coming from a population that is experiencing an exponential growth. When addressing these issues, we need to address these issues and add a technology layer as the accelerator, which is the key to catch up and cope with the increasing demand. Given the demographic pressure on the African continent, which within the next 30 years will be accounting for 50% of the global growth, we believe there is a need to focus on these very basic development pillars. We strongly believe, though, that there is a pressing need to use technology, leapfrog levers, not only to speed up, but to explore new models for growth and development. These sectors emerged as a new category of frontline services during this crisis, while they proved to be essential to guaranteeing food security, continuing education, and appropriate healthcare.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for your opening comments. Obviously, negative and positive implications for COVID-19, new models of working, and new priority sectors for Africa, particularly technology. Thank you to the panelists for those insightful reflections. As we go into the meat of the discussion, there are 3 or 4 key areas that hold special interest for the continent of Africa. And the first one is supporting SMEs and the informal economy. One of the unique challenges is the fact that a large proportion of the population, women especially, work and derive their main source of income from the informal sector. In sub-Saharan Africa, over 74% of women in non-agricultural sectors are in informal employment. The economic fallout of COVID-19 lockdowns across Africa have hit these workers particularly. So I would like us to reflect on this for a few minutes. The UN Global Compact has shared a special appeal for companies to take collective action through implementing the 10 principles of the UNGC. I would like to pose my first question to Undersecretary Songwe. If you could share with us along the theme of the SMEs and the informal economy, what ways leadership and business especially, can ensure that particular attention and support is going to these marginalized groups through these interventions? And what is the UNECA doing to support these efforts and interventions? The focus on SMEs and the informal economy, and maybe touching on women as well. Thank you, Undersecretary Songwe.
Thank you again for that question. So 3 things. The Economic Commission for Africa is a think tank. And one of the first things that we have just done is effectively yesterday, we released a report on exit strategies. And in particular, one of the things we looked at was SMEs, and we actually did a rapid survey of SMEs in Kenya, Jeremy. This is for you. And what it showed is that many of the SMEs are only operating at 40% capacity, either because they no longer have demand, they no longer have access to financing to meet the working capacity that they require, or that their supply chains have been interrupted. So one of the things that we're looking at is to say, how can we ensure that those supply chains continue? And this is particularly important in the food sector, because when we talk about lockdowns, we talk about food. And Bola, to your question a little bit, 80% of our rural women are in the agriculture sector. And in the cities, we worry about the lack of food or the increasing price of food. In the rural areas, 40% of Africa's food gets lost in transportation or in waste because of lack of storage. So we have 2 very opposing problems. In the cities, expensive food or no food. In the rural areas, too much food and no place to store or no means of transportation. And so one of the things that the Economic Commission for Africa is doing is we're working with small businesses to see whether we can ensure that those supply chains are meeting, that interconnection between the rural areas and the cities where we need the food is actually still working. So we're working with governments, and we've put up a sort of border watch to make sure that food can actually flow. We've seen throughout this crisis a lot of conversations in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Rwanda about truck drivers and the need to ensure that they are safe and healthy before they cross borders. Inside those trucks are food, agricultural products that need to be distributed. So we're working to see whether we can build those supply chains. And I think that's one important thing that came out of the analysis that we have done, is how can we link rural areas and rural markets with urban areas and urban markets. I think that in Kibera, they will tell you, if we can't eat, then we can't buy a mask. I think they can eat if we can make sure that the food gets to Kibera and that the price stays low. The second thing that we're doing is we're watching prices. As we all know, on the continent, when prices go up, the risk of crisis, the risk of unstable economies becomes quite large. And so what we're looking at is, can we make sure that we contain prices? Can we make sure that we put resources in the hands of people so that they can get food and they can afford it? And finally, one of the things that we're doing, which we're very proud of, is we had been working before the crisis on trying to see how we could actually get Africa to produce African drugs. $14.7 billion worth of the drugs that we consume on the continent come from outside. 55% of those drugs come from the European Union, and another 20% come from either India or China. All these markets close their supplies to Africa. So all of a sudden, almost 97% of our access to drugs got shut down, our access to PPEs and our access to health services. So the Economic Commission for Africa has partnered with Afri-Exim and a couple of other banks on the continent to see whether we can, one, identify local producers, secondly, ensure that they all sign up onto the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement so that we can actually move goods across continents. And to date, we have, with Afri-Exim over 100 local producers from Tunisia producing test kits, and Senegal, to Ghana, to South Africa producing ventilators. And we're working with all these businesses that will assure them that small businesses stay alive, that particularly women businesses in the mask producing area and in the PPE area are also kept in business. Because for us to be able to restore and recover, we need to at least keep the businesses alive today. And so the first line of business is find those businesses that are already existing, see whether we can ensure that they stay alive, work with Jeremy and the Absa of the world to ensure that some credit is being given to them. At the Economic Commission for Africa, we've brought together all the development financial institutions of Europe, and we're talking with them. They have lines of credit in about 1,000 African banks. And we want to see whether we can increase those lines of credits to 1,000 African banks. It's quite a large number. So that not just increase the credits, but also reduce the cost of capital to them, so that they can eventually give more capital to small SMEs and in particular women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Songwe. You spoke about exit strategies, and I hope that the report that you've just done will be available to the public so that we can actually see it in more detail. The supply chain challenges, prices, and of course, locally manufactured drugs and health supplies on the continent. Thank you very much. I'll now turn to Hassan, also in the area of SMEs. Your company, Africa Impact Ventures, invests in startups and technology SMEs based in Africa. So in the midst of this pandemic, what are some of the unique challenges that you see that SMEs across Africa are facing? And how has your company adjusted to the crisis, with particular reference to tech SMEs? Because there's been a sudden boom of tech startups across the continent, young people going into entrepreneurship. So what are you seeing there, and what opportunities are there, even in the midst of the pandemic, to SMEs, particularly those in the tech space? Thank you, Hassan.
Thank you. I would like to come back to a point that was raised by Ms. Swange about encouraging production in Morocco as related to the pandemic needs. Morocco, that's where I am based, has done a great job in responding positively to this challenge. In fact, from zero, we are now producing 10 million masks a day, and we even patented the new artificial respirators, and we are starting to explore to export that to Africa, to Europe. This has been applauded by the international community, and this could lead the way for other African countries to follow. We have the potential, we have the technology, we just need confidence. To come back to the question, SMEs, which is the critical, which forms a critical mass in Africa. More than 90% of all firms in the continent are SMEs, and they account for pretty much as much in all the business doing in Africa. They have suffered significantly during this crisis, and but the concept of SMEs in Africa is quite different from that definition in Europe or in the US. They are relatively small, fragile, and are already extremely stretched in terms of cash flow. If we take the case of Morocco, we already had more than $6 billion equivalent of unpaid debt prior to the pandemic, and it's mostly debt from large corps and government toward SMEs. This situation would only exacerbate the issue unless we take action in putting in place schemes to support financing of this very small niche of the economy. Again, we are talking about the formal sector. What we would like to see is a significant effort to finance the SME sector, but not just the financing. It's the whole package of measures to support these SMEs in terms of training, digitalization, etc. And this is the only way that this continent will really have a chance to leapfrog forward and unlock the potential of these African SMEs. My company at Africa Impact Ventures, we highly believe the impact is synonymous with action and doing good. If we look at the global investments by asset managers worldwide, we notice a new trend in the allocation of investments going towards investing with a visible impact. So people want to earn money, but at the same time do good. And this is something that's coming quite often among the largest fund managers. Out of the pretty much almost $90 trillion of assets, under management by globally, as reported by the McKinsey study a couple of years back. There's a lot of interest, which is almost amounted to a quarter of the 90 trillion that's going to investment in environmental, social, and governance principles of companies that are sensitive to these issues. The market is growing fast, and this is becoming the new standard during the last decade. So yes, we want to invest, but at the same time do good. So the investors now are focusing on generating a triple results. So they want to generate social impact, environmental impact, but they can at the same time maximize their financial return. So that goes without sacrificing the earning money.
Thank you.
Africa is regarded as the land of opportunities, and according to the Global Impact Investing Network, more than half of the money that will be going to Africa, going to impact investing, will be going to Africa. So there is a huge potential, and we have to be ready to welcome this money.
Thank you.
I have more to say if you want. Can
Okay,
you go ahead?
I have a couple more questions.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a couple more questions, so maybe you can go into that later. But basically, what you've spoken about now is about unlocking potential for the small, fragile SMEs, and looking at generating triple impact, social, economic, and making money. But I'll come back to that a little bit more. I want to move on quickly to Jeremy, who I'd like to comment from a large company perspective. Basically, you had spoken before about what you were doing with colleagues, clients, and you summarized that. But I'd like to know what measures can be instituted to ensure business continuity for SMEs in Africa, and if you could briefly touch on ways in which Absa is specifically providing support to the most affected, because you had spoken before about big companies. So business continuity for SMEs, and how Absa has been able to put in place structures to support these SMEs to remain in business. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. I think the first thing is that the pandemic has, in some senses, forced businesses to rethink their fundamental roles and their fundamental models. So I think more than ever before, we have to think about not just generating shareholder returns, but also creating impact. And we have to create that impact in the short run. So to the points that were mentioned by the Under Secretary, by Hassan, we, as Absa, one of the things we're looking at is how do we support our customers, and in particular SMEs and businesses, to be able to survive this crisis. And typically cash and cash flow have been the biggest things, because trade routes have been impacted, supplies have been impacted, and they're struggling. So as banks, we lend to customers, they have loans they have to repay. And one of the ways that we can alleviate some of this pressure is restructuring their loan arrangements, either deferring principal and interest payments so that they can redirect that cash flow to keeping their operations running. The second area is giving them investment to be able to turn their operations if they are refocusing. So for example, we're seeing companies producing ventilators, companies producing masks, changing their production lines. They may need cash and cash flow to be able to do so. So that's another immediate area. On the business continuity front, I think large companies who have typically had longer time to develop BCP and disaster recovery kind of procedures can work with their customers and do skills transfers around what you need to think about as you are going through these kind of crises. We've worked with our customers in terms of developing frameworks of things we need to think about. We are also running free webinars with our customers around certain things. So for example, we're running one in the next couple of days, which talks about how do you change your business model? How do you, for example, take your business online? What is a business continuity plan? how do I maximize my cash flows? Which areas can I look at? How do I manage my cost base to survive through this process? So I think there's a skills transfer area on that side. I think the other area is really around partnerships. I think we need to think about the entire ecosystem. And as large companies, we have a responsibility to be a force for good. So there can be things we can immediately do. So we can actually support SMEs with more what I would call not charitable, but just donations around equipment, sanitizers, masks that they might struggle to be able to provide themselves because they're struggling with a cash flow perspective, but give those equipments to them to be able to keep them moving. Now, when we look at what we've done very specifically, we've got over 30,000 customers that we've done in terms of retail and SME customers that have been given either restructuring, loan moratoriums, loan holidays to give them that break. We also look at our responsibility as being working with our suppliers. One of the decisions that we made as an organization here in Kenya is to speed up paying our invoices to these SMEs faster. So for smaller amounts, less than $10,000, we want to pay them within 7 days. We don't want to kick it out to 60, 90 days, which may be the typical terms. For all other invoices, we want to pay them within 14 days. That just eases the cash flow pressure. So I think when we work together with them, the focus here is working together, is protecting their employees, is keeping them open to manage the vulnerable. The last area of partnership is obviously what can we do to protect healthcare workers and the most vulnerable? Because by working together, we can put together our distribution capabilities. So for example, we raised money. If we want to give out food packages to the most vulnerable, there are people with those delivery mechanisms that they're able to use to be able to get these foods to the most vulnerable. Sometimes they can give it for free. Sometimes the larger companies have to accept that now is the time when we have to use our deeper pockets to do good for society. So those are a few of the things we're trying to do with our customers to essentially buy time to try and manage this crisis as it unfolds.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thanks for elaborating a bit on specifically what you're doing with the SMEs. And indeed, I was going to turn to the power of partnerships before we take one or two of the audience questions. And the power of partnerships and collaborations across the African continent. As we know, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement implementation has been postponed slightly, and therefore there probably is a need for African countries to come together in any case to see what can be done collaboratively across the continent. The virus came to the continent a bit later than other regions, so I guess our leaders even had more time to prepare. And since the beginning of the crisis, we've also seen coalitions with businesses and governments being formed. In fact, some of our global compact local networks across Africa have also shared an appeal for these coalitions to call for responsible business action, ensuring that the focus is on the most vulnerable. I'd like to turn to Undersecretary Vera for this. And from your different perspectives and experiences, what would you say are the benefits of the partnerships, and what lessons can be learned that can be applied to other more enduring and persistent issues across Africa? Because we've got health, we've got food, infrastructure, gender equality, and so on that Africa is contending with. But if you could share with us one or two perspectives on the lessons that can be learned, or that one could learn from the partnerships that we're seeing across the continent. Thank you, Undersecretary.
Thank you very much. I think if you permit, let me go for once to the macro question. Again, I started by saying that when the crisis started, we met with ministers of finance. I think that has been one of the most powerful partnerships that we have had, because when the ministers of finance came together as one coordinated platform and called on the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the other multilateral agencies to say, we're in trouble and we need support, there was an immediate reaction. And so first we got this collaborative platform on the continent that then reached out to the multilateral organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the European Union, as we saw, and many more. And immediately what we got was some amount of relief The IMF, for example, has already disbursed almost $18 billion onto the continent. The World Bank is at $4 billion. We have gotten what we called for at the time a debt standstill on the bilateral. The G20 then came together to talk about Africa, has given us a bilateral standstill. And yesterday, I think one of the most powerful partnerships was the whole creditors, the bond markets that came together again with the ministers of finance to say, let's work around how we can work with you to ensure that we find some workable way. And I think it's Jeremy and Hassan who talked about liquidity. What we are seeing in this crisis is a crisis of liquidity. Our governments do not have the kinds of resources that they need to be able to defend the currency, to be able to buy the drugs, to be able to buy the PPEs, to be able to buy the food. So we need that foreign exchange, and we need it desperately. And I think the meeting that we had yesterday with the global creditor market was important, first of all, because it showed that Africa has grown up. Africa has access to the credit markets. But when Africa gets into trouble, because the world is in trouble, not because Africa has done anything wrong, those global creditors value Africa as a market that they want to stay in over the long run. And so we had this conversation about how can business and how can bondholders talk together and ensure that Africa saves at least $44 billion that we can then re-inject into our economies to rebuild and restore better. So I think for me, this is one of the big partnerships, is that starting at the macro level, because we talk about debt and we talk about loans and it seems very far away. But when you bring it down to saying, we can save our airline industry. We hear today, for example, South Africa, 4,700 people out of a job. Mauritius Airline about to file for bankruptcy. If we can stay those interest payments, we can actually re-inject those resources into our service sectors, into our economies, and keep them alive. And I think it's that trend of sort of the partnership from the global level to the regional level, to the national level, and then to the local SME. And I think those partnerships with civil society, ensuring, and this is my final point, one of the most important things that we're now working on is to say, how can we build partnerships with civil society to trace and track the money? Once we get the resources, can we make sure that those resources go to the people that need it most? And there we need different partnerships with business, with civil society to ensure that it works well.
Well, thank you very much. And indeed, as you said very clearly, the power of partnerships, immediate relief from the discussions that we had across the continent with the multilateral lenders and the likes of the EU, and of course the crisis of liquidity, civil society to trace and track where the money is. And I think this is very much on the lips of very many Africans right now, with the funds being raised for the coalition. So thank you very much for that. I've tried to weave some of the questions from the audience into some of the questions that have been asked already, but there's one specific one which is on the Sustainable Development Goals. And the question is this. So I'd like each of us to think about it as we're coming to a close now for this event. Sustainable Development Goals implementation requires a number of vital cogs to work together, including policy stability, innovative financial models, effective technology, global collaborations, and FDI. So how practically are SDGs achievable by 2030, and what is the role of business to change the calculus of events due to the challenges brought by COVID-19 in the short, medium, and long term? He's talking about all the various cogs that drive the SDGs, but how practically are they achievable by 2030? And given COVID-19, there may be a change of how countries, individuals, businesses approach the SDGs due to the challenges brought on by COVID-19. So I will go back to the Undersecretary to respond to this as we round up now. And whilst you do this, if you could also give your last final reflections in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Two things. The first is building back better, as our Secretary General has spoken about. And the secret to building back better is ensuring that we do a climate resilient rebuild. We know from the fabulous and amazing work of Professor Nick Stern that if we build back into a more sustainable, more green economy, we can create $23 trillion worth of additional revenue into the global economy, and we can create 26 million new jobs. Africa needs about 13 million new jobs a year to be able to absorb all the unemployment that we have on the continent. So there is the big sort of macro answer is resilient green climate economy. If we do that and we do that well, we can build back better, we can build back faster. We also know that when we do more resilient, more climate-friendly economies, then we're taking care of our girls, we're taking care of our women, and women are the ones who are doing the beurre de karité, they're the ones who are doing the organic cashew nuts in Guinea-Bissau, and they're the ones who are doing the flowers. So women are already in this climate-resilient economy, but we need to invest massively in energy to make sure that that happens, and we need to make sure that we invest massively in clean energy. So I think getting to 2030 has clearly been made a lot harder by the COVID pandemic, but I think the opportunity coming out of it is that we can now maybe recorrect and go back into a clean economy, which had been so difficult to achieve. The lockdowns have cost our economies, but they have saved our climate. Can we now, coming out of this, ensure that the cost of the economy is smaller than the saving and the new, the birds that are singing and the cleaner air and maybe a better health and less accidents that we're getting, and how can we build back better? So I really think coming again together as a community, we can probably get back into a greener, healthier, and much faster growth economy than we were before this crisis. But before we do that, we need to go back to making sure that we save lives. And that is important, and I think that this is where policy becomes particularly important, but all of us have to make sure that as we open up and as we do the exit strategies, we ensure that our government can test, they can trace, and they can protect the women in particular from this crisis. And that we ensure, as we speak today, we have about 350 million African kids out of school. We need to make sure that we find different ways, and I think it's Hassan who talked about technology. Once we come out of this crisis, 27% access to technology for our rural kids will not be good enough. And so we need to make sure that we can change that and that we can do better.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'll now go on to Hassan for his closing remarks. And Hassan, I'd like you to reflect on a particular question, which is in relation to investments and female-owned and managed SMEs. This question is from Adesola who runs a female-led private equity firm. And the question is around the $42 billion capital gap for women on the continent, according to the AFDB. And how do we ensure that access to capital for women isn't worsened as a result of this crisis, as most investors become more risk averse? So if you could respond and just round up within 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to come back to a very sensitive point, which is the African youth. If you look at the numbers, and they talk for themselves, 60%, more than 60% of the total population is youth that is under the age of 25. If we look at the job market, only 1% go to entrepreneurship. If we look at the graduates, even with their diploma, 25% are already unemployed. All with this in mind, look at the population in Africa. It will be doubling within the next 30 years. It will be exceeding the population of China within 100 years. So we will be exceeding 4.5 billion people. The impact theme is becoming very recurring among investors worldwide. We looked at again, I'm going to talk about this topic, but at the very macro level. We looked at the main specific impact subjects, and the ones that come more often is agriculture, education, health, financial inclusion, and all this within a clear energy context. If you look at Africa, with this population growing, we need to feed them, we need to provide healthcare, we need to educate them, have them financially in. For this reason, we have partnered with local schools in Morocco, and the approach is we would take the graduating students, we would assign them a specific topic within these pillars, with an impact investing mindset, and that we started this initiative about in 2019. We have already enrolled almost 20 participants with about 10 startups that are coming to life. We have more than four nationalities from Africa, and our women participants account for a third. So we are very sensitive to the youth employability and women empowerment. So we are building leaders, we are building future entrepreneurs, and this is what Africa really needs. Our basic model is pretty much building companies, and we would do it in a way that we go to the market quite shortly, as opposed to a regular business would do. So within 4 or 5 months, already the company is in the market and up and running. And we have been very pleased to see how the participants, the graduating students, are very enthusiastic about this, and they are already on the market with a job and with a stake in the company. Again, with all what we're doing is with this mindset of looking at the main pillars and investing, earning money, but doing good at the same time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hassan. You've spoken about the power of partnerships, rebooting the economy, and the work that's being done in relation to youth employability and women. And finally, I turn to Jeremy. Jeremy, I'm asking this, it's a combination of some of the questions that have come in from participants, and it's basically about the unbanked population and financial inclusion. So as a big bank, do you see COVID-19 catalyzing the work that has been done across the continent and accelerating the increase in financial inclusion and bringing the unbanked population into the system from mobile banking, mobile money, and so on? And then your last reflection, if you could do this in 2 minutes, because we're over time already. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you, Bola. Yes, I mean, I think we've turned a corner now that we've gone through this COVID-19 pandemic. What it has shown is that we must use technology if we're to achieve some of the things where we're asking people to do: social distancing, staying at home. So people are much more aware that, can I do this transaction, for example, digitally on my mobile instead of using cash? And people are also scared. Is there a chance that I might catch the coronavirus using cash? So definitely, for sure, we have seen an increase of using different channels, and I think we're going to see an increase in financial inclusion as a result. I think the banks and the telcos have done quite a lot already here in Kenya. For example, we've waived a number of the fees for doing transactions between people, for doing B2B, B2C, C2B transactions, so that people have those options. So I think that part we've turned the corner, but we've still got more work to do around bringing in more technology to make it even more frictionless as we go forward, with even less cost, so that we can move money and resources around the system. So I think from my perspective, when I look at, just as closing comments, I think there are 4 or 5 things that I think are critical. One we've touched on is partnerships. The second that I think we need to talk about is sustainability. There's technology, and then the last 2 aspects are alignment and coordination. I think Under-Secretary talked about things we can do at a macro level, at a government level. That needs to be coordinated well with the private sector to come up with specific initiatives that are going to take care of the respective stakeholders, whether they're SMEs, whether they're large business, whether they're youth, whether they're women businesses, whether they're physically challenged businesses. Sustainability is going to be key. We have to, more than ever, is build sustainability into our strategies. It can't be something done on the side of the desk. It actually has to be ingrained. So the SDGs have to be ingrained in our core strategy. And I believe, like banks like ours as Absa, we're ingraining them every time we look. For example, this morning I was looking at acquiring masks, and I'm asking, I would like to buy masks from women-run businesses, from physically challenged businesses. So I'm saying, where are those businesses? How do I get access to those businesses? And you'll be surprised, that is a challenge in and of itself. So those sustainability indicators have to be part and parcel of our business. In terms of technology, we have to use technology and use this opportunity to encourage innovation in every way to solve our own problems, because Africa's problems are unique. We can't do some of the things that are being done out there, like social distancing. If you're in informal settlements, you can't solve the problem the same way you can if you're in the US. We don't have the same social safety nets. So I think private enterprise has got to be more supporting. And then it comes down to the last two things. We need alignment and coordination of our efforts so that we don't underclub in one area and overclub in another. And I think this is really where we come to bringing everybody together to help save lives, to help look after the vulnerable. This is time for care, attention, and compassion for each other. It's not just about shareholder returns. Obviously, shareholder returns are essential, but we need to do it in a sustainable way that makes a difference and addresses some of the things we've talked about around unemployment, dealing with the vulnerable, etc. So those would be my final comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Music to the ears of everyone. Partnership, sustainability, technology against the backdrop of alignment and coordination. Well, time passes so quickly, and we're now at the end of the event. It's one in the United Nations Global Compact Special Academy series. And just as a reminder, our theme today is regional perspectives on leadership in a global crisis. This year marks the start of the decade of action. Although the COVID-19 crisis undoubtedly brings extraordinary challenges to the achievement of the SDGs, it also brings extraordinary opportunities for solidarity, and this has been covered by all the speakers. So we need to push to deepen our efforts during this decade of action to recover better and build a healthier, a safer, a fairer, and a more prosperous world. I'd like to thank our speakers once again, Ms. Bera Songwe, the United Nations Undersecretary and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. I'd also like to thank Jeremy Awori, my former colleague in Standard Chartered Bank, who is now the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Absa Bank, Kenya. And also Hassan Medagrhi, all the way from Morocco, the founding partner of Africa Impact Ventures. Thank you so much to the participants. Thank you to all who have called in. I hope you found the session inspiring and insightful, and do have a good week, and please all stay safe. Thank you very much.